Why did no one move? Why did every soldier in the mess hall sit frozen, eyes wide, mouths half open, as if the air itself had locked them in place? The sound had vanished. No clatter of trays, no barked laughter echoing off the concrete walls. Just silence, and the image of one man's hand shoving a woman's head into a toilet. Her name was Captain Elena Ramirez. The colonel's grip had been iron, his authority absolute. In one violent motion he had spun her, dragged her to the latrine and forced her down. Cold water closed over her face. The sting of disinfectant filled her nose, and humiliation, sharp, suffocating, searing, bit deeper than the water ever could. Gasps broke across the room. A spoon clattered against a tray. One soldier muttered, "Jesus Christ!" But no one rose, no one dared. When he yanked her upright again, water streamed down her hair, soaking the collar of her uniform, dripping in steady beats onto the tile floor. She coughed, breath hitching, but her eyes, dark, unyielding, locked onto his. Colonel Douglas Harrington sneered, lips curling in satisfaction, as though he had reasserted order in front of his troops. "Next time," he hissed, his voice low and venomous, "you'll remember your place." He released her arm, letting her stumble back against the wall. Silence. It was the kind of silence that carried weight. It pressed down on every soldier seated at the long metal tables, suffocating, warning. Forks hovered midair. Glances flickered, then dropped to trays. A sergeant opened his mouth, then shut it when Elena's eyes met his. Everyone knew the truth. To challenge Harrington was to risk a career. To speak up was to sign a death warrant for one's future in uniform. So no one spoke. Elena stood dripping, chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Humiliation burned deep, a scalding heat that threatened to choke her, but layered within it, tightening like steel in her spine, was something else. Resolve. She would not cry. She would not give him that victory. The colonel barked toward the room, "Back to your meals. Show over." And just like that he turned, shoulders squared, medals gleaming, walking out with the confidence of a man convinced he had stamped out defiance. The faint drip of water from Elena's hair was louder than any footsteps. When she finally walked out of the mess hall, her boots striking the floor in a rhythm sharper than usual, soldiers avoided her gaze. Some looked away in shame, some in awe, a few with something unspoken, silent admiration. They all knew, they had all witnessed it. Harrington thought it was dominance, but for Elena it was the beginning of something else. A breaking point. That night in the privacy of her quarters, the moment replayed in her mind like a cruel film reel. Harrington's sneer, the gasps, the icy water. She peeled off her soaked uniform, sat at her desk in silence, and reached for her notebook. Her hands trembled. Her pen pressed hard enough to tear the page. She wrote everything, the words spoken, the time, the witnesses, the smell of the disinfectant, the look on Harrington's face when he forced her down. Every detail mattered. Every line of ink was a safeguard against erasure. By the time she set the pen down, the humiliation had shifted. It had become something else, a mission. She stared at the page, the letters still drying under the dim desk lamp. Harrington may have dunked her head in a toilet, but he had not broken her. And one day, he would regret underestimating her. The next morning the base moved as though nothing had happened. Boots struck pavement. Radios crackled. Orders were barked. But beneath the rhythm of military life, something had changed. Elena could feel it in the way conversations stopped when she passed, in the way groups thinned, scattering as if her presence carried danger. By dawn, the mess hall incident was everywhere. Whispers twisted, reshaped. Some versions exaggerated, others softened, but the truth was impossible to disguise. The colonel had shoved Captain Elena Ramirez's head into a toilet in front of half the base. At breakfast, she sat alone. Normally, junior officers gravitated toward her. She had a reputation for fairness, for listening when others didn't. But this time, trays clustered at distant tables. Eyes flicked toward her, then dropped away. No one wanted to sit too close. She chewed without tasting. Her stomach turned, not from the food, but from the invisible wall building around her. Later that day, she entered the operations office. Two men who had been laughing moments earlier stiffened, papers shuffled, a chair scraped. Their avoidance was loud, heavier than words. "Don't get involved. Don't risk your career." It stung worse than the water had. Harrington's violence had lasted seconds, but this slow bleed of silence was 1,000 tiny cuts. That evening at the daily briefing, Harrington sat at the head of the table, calm, smug, his voice authoritative. Elena walked in. The room stiffened. Eyes flicked at her, then dropped. "Ramirez," Harrington said, deliberately stripping her rank. "You'll oversee supply chain review tomorrow. Try not to misinterpret directives this time." A ripple of forced laughter traveled around the table. Shallow, awkward, but loud enough to sting. Harrington leaned back, satisfied. Elena remained still, her jaw clenched. Her silence was survival. But later, alone in her quarters, silence became something else, an accusation. She opened her notebook again, wrote down every detail, the omission of her rank, the laughter, the looks of avoidance. If she didn't record it, Harrington would twist it. He would call it misunderstanding. He would bury it in bureaucracy. No, she wouldn't let him. Still, the weight pressed down. Was she alone? Was she doomed to fight an unwinnable battle? The answer came quietly. The next day, Corporal Jenkins approached her outside the barracks. He looked around nervously before speaking. "Ma'am," he said softly, "for what it's worth, I saw what happened. I wish I'd done something." His words carried guilt, his eyes shame. Elena's throat tightened. She wanted to thank him, to cling to the thread of humanity, but she knew the risk he took just speaking. "I understand, Jenkins," she said. "Don't compromise yourself." He nodded and walked away quickly, but his confession lingered. He wasn't the only one. Dozens had witnessed it. Fear kept them silent. The chain of command prided itself on discipline, on hierarchy. But in the wrong hands, discipline was a weapon, a shield for abusers. Elena stared at herself in the mirror that night, hair damp from a shower, eyes tired, unyielding. The memory of Harrington's grip burned in her skin. No, she wasn't overreacting. She had been assaulted, humiliated. If she stayed silent, she would be complicit in her own erasure. From that night on, she made a decision. She would endure the whispers, the avoidance, the isolation, but she would also prepare. She would forge her silence into strength. Every page she filled, every detail she recorded was a weapon, not of steel but of truth. The base could pretend nothing happened, but one day everyone would know. That night, closing her notebook, Elena whispered to herself, not a vow, but a reminder. He hadn't broken her, and he never would. Why did silence feel heavier than violence? That question haunted her in the days after the mess hall incident. The colonel's hand on her arm, the cold water on her face, those had lasted seconds. But the silence lingered, stretching across every corridor, every briefing, every meal. It was everywhere. At breakfast, tables that once welcomed her now emptied as she walked in. Forks scraped trays awkwardly, eyes darted toward her and snapped back to plates. The smell of powdered eggs turned her stomach, not because of the food, but because of what it meant. No one wanted to be near her. At the operations office, the same pattern repeated. Laughter died when she entered. Postures stiffened. Men buried themselves in meaningless paperwork as if ink could shield them from association. It was worse than open hostility. They didn't jeer. They didn't insult. They simply vanished from her presence. Her isolation was total. In her notebook, she recorded everything. A log of silence. Lieutenant Parker avoiding her eyes. Sergeant Dorsey straightening papers until his knuckles went white. Jenkins' hushed apology in the shadows. Every detail mattered. Harrington would claim it was exaggeration, a misunderstanding. But the truth had weight and she would give it anchors. Still, doubt gnawed at her. At night she stared at her reflection. Was she overreacting? Would speaking out make things worse? She was one captain. Harrington had decades of service, medals, connections. Against him, she was a lone voice in a storm. And yet silence was not safety. It was complicity. That thought steadied her hand as she wrote. Her entries became mission logs, not weapons training or tactical drills, but words. Exact phrasing Harrington had used, dates, witnesses, the stairs, even the temperature of the water dripping from her face. Armor not of steel but of ink. But armor wasn't enough. She needed allies. One evening she found Parker in the supply room. He had worked under her before. He respected her judgment. She closed the door softly, lowering her voice. "Parker," she said, "you were there, you saw it, didn't you?" He froze, his knuckles whitened around the clipboard, his breath quickened. For a long moment he said nothing. "You don't have to do anything," she added. "Just tell me, did you see?" His eyes flicked to hers, guilt flashing, then fear. He gave a single, sharp nod. Then he looked away. It wasn't much, but it was something. She didn't press him further. She couldn't risk it. But that flicker of truth warmed her chest. She wasn't entirely alone. Still, the base pressed in on her. Harrington's smug smirk at briefings, his deliberate omission of her rank, the forced laughter that followed, each moment small enough to dismiss in isolation, but together a pattern of intimidation. And she wrote it all. But paper wouldn't be enough. She needed someone outside Harrington's reach, someone who still believed rank did not excuse cruelty. That's when she thought of Major Samuel Torres, retired, mentor, a man who once told her, "Integrity is the only uniform that doesn't fade." Reaching him wasn't simple. She waited until weekend leave, traveled 2 hours into town, and met him at a roadside cafe. Torres listened as she spoke, his jaw tightening with every detail. The mess hall, the silence, the retaliation. "Damn it, Elena," he muttered, voice low but sharp. "I wish I could say I'm surprised, but I've seen men like Harrington before. They think rank makes them gods." Her throat tightened. For the first time since it happened, her voice cracked. "If I file a complaint, they'll bury it, or bury me." Torres leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Then don't give them the chance. Document everything. Build a case so strong they can't ignore it. And when you're ready, don't go through the chain. Go above it." His words sank deep, heavy as steel. A plan, dangerous, but a plan. She returned to base, sharper, more deliberate. Her notebook was no longer just for memory. It became evidence. She wrote names, dates, overheard conversations, patterns, retaliations, the subtle reassignment stripping her responsibilities, the laughter at briefings. Every slight, every omission, every silence. But even with evidence, the nights were long. Fear whispered in the dark. Harrington was powerful. She was one officer. Could she survive this? Her fingers would trace the inked pages, each line proof she wasn't imagining it, that what she endured was real. And she endured. Then one night there was a knock at her door, light, hesitant. "Corporal Jenkins." His face pale, his voice trembling. "Ma'am, I know I said I couldn't get involved, but I can't stay silent anymore. If you need someone to back you up, I'll do it. I can't pretend I didn't see." Elena stared, surprised. Fear lived in his eyes, but so did determination. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. He swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." And in that moment she realized something. Fear was contagious, but so was courage. Harrington thought he had broken her. But every cruel word, every calculated slight, every silence that suffocated the air, all of it was fuel. She wasn't broken, she was preparing. Her weapons were not rifles or grenades, they were paper, ink, and courage. And when the time came, she would be ready. Why did her heart stop at the sight of a headline? She had been off duty. walking through a small town 2 hours from base, when the words caught her eye on a newsstand. Whispers of abuse at local military base. Sources speak of colonel's misconduct. Her throat tightened. Hands trembling, she bought the paper and ducked into a diner, sliding into the farthest booth. The details were vague, names withheld, but the story was unmistakable. A senior officer humiliating a subordinate, retaliation against those who questioned him, a culture of silence strangling the base. She hadn't spoken to a journalist. She told no one outside Torres and Jenkins. So who had? Or had the investigation she quietly set in motion already begun pulling threads loose? It didn't matter, the secret was out. Back on base, tension buzzed in the air. Soldiers walked stiffer, conversations clipped, eyes darting toward shadows as though walls themselves might listen. Suspicion spread like fire. Who had spoken? Who could be trusted? Who might betray them? Colonel Harrington acted unbothered. He strutted through corridors with his usual swagger, barking orders with iron confidence. But Elena noticed the twitch at his jaw when whispers rippled in his wake, the flicker of irritation when cameras appeared outside the gate. The chain of command scrambled to contain it. Briefings filled with phrases like internal matter, baseless rumors, detrimental to morale. Officers were warned, do not engage with the press. Soldiers were threatened, leaks will not be tolerated. The harder they clamped down, the more the rumors spread. Division cracked the surface. Some whispered Elena was a troublemaker, tarnishing the uniform. Others, though silent in public, watched her square shoulders and wondered if they could have endured the same humiliation without breaking. One evening, back in her quarters, she found a folded note slipped under her door. "We believe you, stay strong." She read it again and again. Her chest tightened. She didn't know who had written it, but it burned like a torch in the dark. The silence around her was shifting. The following week, investigators arrived. Not in uniform, but in plain suits carrying folders and recorders. They walked the halls with quiet authority, eyes sharp, movements precise. Soldiers stiffened when approached, their voices clipped, rehearsed, but unease bled through cracks. Elena was summoned first. A windowless room, a table, her notebook in front of her. She folded her hands, inhaled, and began. She told them everything: the mess hall, the cold water, the retaliation, the silence. They didn't interrupt. Pens scratched against paper. When she finished, the room was still. "Captain Ramirez," one finally said, "you understand the risks of making these statements." She met his eyes. "Yes, but I also understand the risks of silence." Her words hung heavy in the air. News of her testimony spread quietly. Those loyal to Harrington muttered she was exaggerating, emotional, out to destroy a decorated career, but others began to waver. For the first time, the shield of Harrington's invincibility cracked. The next evening, as she sat alone in the mess hall, Lieutenant Parker slid into the seat across from her. His voice low, urgent. "I'm ready." She frowned. Ready for what? "To tell the truth," he whispered. "I saw what he did to you. I've been sick with it ever since." Her breath caught. Weeks of isolation, weeks of carrying the weight alone, and now here he was. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. Parker nodded. "I should have spoken that night. Better late than never." The next day, he gave his testimony. A week later, 2 more followed. Each time a witness spoke, the base shifted. Harrington's loyalists whispered betrayal, but those who had been paralyzed by fear began to see possibility. If Parker could survive, maybe they could too. The investigators moved methodically. Harrington still strutted through halls, but his laughter at briefings rang hollow. His voice barked with the same authority, but his eyes carried a flicker of doubt. Behind closed doors, his temper cracked. Elena overheard him one afternoon, snapping at an aide. "You think a few cowards are going to ruin me? I built this base." But the words carried desperation. Outside the gates, the media frenzy swelled. Headlines demanded accountability. Television panels debated whether the military's culture of silence had enabled misconduct too long. Reporters crowded fences, cameras flashing. Inside, the whispers multiplied. Some still called Elena reckless. Others quietly called her brave. One night, Jenkins knocked softly on her door again. "Ma'am," he said, "things are changing, people are talking. They're scared, but they're watching you. They see you standing tall, it's giving them courage. Whatever happens, you've already made a difference." She closed her eyes, exhaustion sinking deep. But when she opened them, resolve burned brighter. He was right, the story was no longer just hers. The question wasn't whether Harrington felt the heat of the spotlight. It was how long he could survive under it before it consumed him. Why do the guilty always look so calm in front of a camera? Colonel Harrington had weathered storms before: deployments, politics, budget cuts. He believed this would be no different. In his mind, he was untouchable. Rank, medals, decades of service, all shields against scrutiny. "Never let them see you bleed," he muttered to himself in the mirror one morning. He straightened his uniform until the ribbons gleamed, jaw locked, eyes steeled. This was just another battle, and battles he knew how to fight. The first strike was denial. At an emergency staff meeting, Harrington leaned back in his chair, voice calm, steady, exuding the authority of a wronged man. "These rumors," he said, "are baseless fabrications. A soldier who cannot handle discipline has twisted events to fit her narrative. I will not let weakness undo everything we've built here." A few nodded. Others stayed silent, unease flickering in their eyes. But Harrington pressed on, hammering his words with conviction. Rank carried its own kind of truth. Next came the smear campaign. Quietly, surgically, Harrington seeded doubt. Whispers spread through the base. Captain Ramirez was unstable, emotional, resentful at being passed over for promotion. She was clever, he warned confidants, clever enough to play the victim. By week's end, the rumors seeped into every corridor. Soldiers exchanged knowing looks in the mess hall. Conversations hushed when Elena entered. Had she exaggerated? Had humiliation turned into a personal vendetta? The strategy worked for a time. But Elena had anticipated it. When investigators asked about whispers of instability, she stayed calm. Her voice steady, her words precise. "They'll say I'm emotional, they'll say I'm ambitious, but facts don't lie. What happened in that mess hall was not discipline, it was degradation." Her restraint contrasted sharply with Harrington's bluster. She offered no theatrics, no sound bites, just truth. And truth, once spoken plainly, carried weight. Still, Harrington was skilled in optics. Cameras caught him at the base gates, reporters shouting questions. He stood tall, medals catching the sun, voice firm, unwavering. "I have dedicated my life to serving this country. These allegations are false. This is a personal attack designed to smear my record. I will not allow it to distract from our mission." The footage aired that night. To the casual viewer, he looked every bit the decorated officer he claimed to be: disciplined, loyal, resolute. But behind closed doors, the cracks deepened. He barked at aides, demanded loyalty pledges, lashed out when reports didn't go his way. His temper no longer simmered quietly, it boiled over. And soldiers noticed. "If he's innocent," one whispered in the barracks, "why is he trying so hard to shut everyone up?" "Because he knows he's guilty," another replied. Rumors of his anger only fed the media frenzy. Analysts debated whether his public calm was a mask. Commentators asked if the culture of deference to rank had enabled misconduct too long. Harrington doubled down. He gave interviews scoffing at political correctness. "This is the new reality," he told a reporter. "A man raises his voice and suddenly it's abuse. Discipline is mistaken for humiliation. If this continues, the military will collapse under its own softness." Some applauded him, calling him old school, a relic of real leadership. Others saw only arrogance, a man blind to his own cruelty. Elena, meanwhile, chose silence. When asked by journalists for comment, she said only, "The truth will speak for itself." That restraint became its own weapon. One evening, investigator Calloway, sharp-eyed, steady, remarked to her partner after an interview, "He's overplaying his hand. Every time he opens his mouth, he shows us who he is." But Harrington still had influence. He called in favors, leaned on connections, demanded loyalty from those above him. For weeks, it seemed possible he might survive as he always had, by being louder, stronger, untouchable. Then the testimonies began to stack. Parker's words aligned with Jenkins'. Jenkins' account aligned with Torr's. Details converged with uncanny precision. The laughter in the briefing, the deliberate omission of rank, the smirk after the toilet. A mosaic of truth formed, undeniable. Late one night, Harrington sat alone in his office. Photos lined the wall, parades, medals, ceremonies. He clenched his fists, rage simmering. "They won't take this from me," he growled. "Not her, not anyone." But deep down, for the first time, he felt it. The creeping realization that denial, smears, and bravado were no longer enough. The spotlight burned hotter. And no uniform, no medal, no rank could shield him from its glare. Why does courage spread like fire when fear had ruled for so long? It began quietly, almost invisibly. Lieutenant Parker had already testified. Corporal Jenkins had stepped forward. Their words were on record. Still, most soldiers hesitated, their fear ingrained by years of rigid hierarchy. Harrington's shadow loomed large. But fear has cracks, and once light slips through, it grows. Jenkins was the first ripple. For days, he had told himself he couldn't risk it. Harrington's influence stretched too far. But the memory of that night, Elena's head forced into the toilet, water streaming down her uniform, dignity stripped in front of a silent hall, gnawed at him. One evening, unable to sleep, he found investigator Calloway in the barracks corridor. His voice trembled, but his eyes were steady. "I can't stay silent anymore," he whispered. "I saw everything, I'll tell the truth." That single act opened a door. Soon after, a senior sergeant, long loyal to Harrington but quietly disturbed, requested a private interview. His statement revealed more than the toilet incident. It described years of public shamming, subtle punishments, veiled threats. Piece by piece, a mosaic of intimidation emerged. Harrington, sensing the tide, tightened his grip. Private meetings, veiled threats. "Remember who you serve," he warned. "Choose wisely where you stand." His words were meant to instill fear, but fear had begun to crack. The base had seen too much. Witnesses came forward, at first in whispers, then with more resolve. They described briefings where Elena's rank was erased, assignments stripped from her, jokes made at her expense, a pattern precise and deliberate. Investigators cross-checked every detail against Elena's notes. Her pages aligned with their statements line for line. Each corroboration chipped at Harrington's facade. By the second week of interviews, the base itself felt transformed. Soldiers who once looked away now offered discreet nods in passing. Notes slipped under her door carried words like, "We're with you." Small gestures, but to Elena they felt like oxygen after months of suffocating silence. And outside the gates, the media pressure mounted. Reports grew bolder. Headlines no longer spoke in whispers. They demanded accountability. Panels debated openly. Had rank become a shield for abuse? For the first time, Elena realized her story had grown larger than her humiliation. It wasn't about one colonel and one captain. It was about the culture itself, the unspoken rules that allowed silence to thrive. Late one evening, Jenkins visited her quarters again. His face pale, but his voice steadier than before. "Ma'am," he said, "things are changing. People are scared, yes, but they're watching you. They see you walking with your head high, and it's giving them courage. Whatever happens, you've already made a difference. Exhaustion weighed on her bones, but those words, they cut through the fatigue, lit something inside. He was right. This wasn't just about her anymore. The spotlight was glaring now, hot and unyielding, and Harrington was standing in the center of it. The question wasn't whether he could feel its burn. It was how long before it consumed him. Why does the truth feel heavier when spoken aloud? Because once it leaves a single mouth, it cannot be put back. At first only Parker and Jenkins had spoken, then a sergeant, then another, quiet voices trembling, each carrying a piece of the puzzle. But one evening everything shifted. 5 officers, men senior to Parker and Jenkins, men respected, seasoned, requested an emergency meeting with the investigators. In a private room, they sat stiff-backed, uniforms pressed, jaws tight, and one by one they gave their statements. Each testimony aligned, weaving months of intimidation and retaliation into a single, damning tapestry. Elena's notebook had never felt so heavy in her hands. Her words were no longer alone. Harrington's defenses crumbled. His denials, his smear campaigns, his bluster, all were hollow against a chorus of voices. Yet on the surface he fought harder. His laughter in briefings grew louder, almost manic. His reprimands sharper, his punishments more arbitrary. He barked at aides for trivial errors, berated junior officers in public. But everyone could see it. The mask was slipping. And the base, once cowed into silence, was changing. Soldiers whispered in corridors, but now the whispers carried something new, defiance. Notes slipped under Elena's door no longer said, "Stay strong." They said, "We believe you." It was subtle but undeniable. Courage had become contagious. One afternoon, Investigator Calloway handed Elena a folder. Inside were statements, carefully documented. Her own testimony, Parker's, Jenkins, the sergeants, the 5 officers. Each one layered on the last, painting Harrington not as a misunderstood disciplinarian but as a tyrant cloaked in rank. For the first time since that awful day in the mess hall, Elena felt it. Vindication. Not victory, not yet, but the first spark of it. That night she walked the empty corridors of the base. The walls that had once suffocated her now echoed differently. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was charged. When she stepped into the mess hall, the memory of that moment months ago hit her, water dripping from her hair, humiliation pressing into her bones. But now, the space felt altered. Not just a theater of shame, but a place where the silence had finally broken. And Harrington knew it. Behind closed doors, his temper boiled. He held private meetings demanding loyalty, issued veiled threats. "Remember who you serve," he hissed at wavering officers. But his words no longer inspired fear. They revealed desperation. The investigators noted everything. His erratic behavior, his inconsistencies, his attempts to smear her as unstable. Each outburst, each denial, each manipulative phrase became another nail in the coffin. And still Elena remained steady. When journalists asked for comment, she offered none. The truth will speak for itself. Her silence became louder than his words. The breakthrough wasn't procedural. It was personal. She had endured humiliation, isolation, months of erasure. Yet here now, the walls around him were collapsing not because she shouted, but because she had held her ground long enough for others to find theirs. Courage had spread. And once it spread, Harrington could no longer contain it. The tide had turned. For Elena, it was no longer about whether she would be believed. It was about how far the truth would reach, and how many others it might set free. Why do walls that once seemed immovable crumble in silence? The morning air was crisp, the base strangely quiet. Whispers had already spread through the barracks before official word arrived. The investigation was complete. Colonel Douglas Harrington, once untouchable, once the man whose shadow bent every room, had been relieved of command, pending further review. The announcement rippled across the base like shockwaves. Soldiers traded glances in the corridors, voices hushed but sharp with disbelief. For years, Harrington's authority had seemed unshakable. His anger had been law, his presence suffocating. Now, in a few sentences, the walls that had sheltered his arrogance cracked wide open. Elena Ramirez walked those same corridors, her boots clicking against polished floors. Every step felt heavier than usual, not with fear, but with something stranger. Relief, vindication, and yet exhaustion. She passed soldiers who once avoided her eyes. Now their stares lingered, respectful, cautious, tinged with something new. Admiration. Some offered quiet nods as she walked by, not out of protocol, out of recognition. The whispers that once strangled the base had shifted. They no longer whispered her humiliation. They whispered her courage. Inside the mess hall, the very place where her dignity had been ripped away, she felt the shift most clearly. No longer did silence collapse around her presence. Soldiers didn't scatter. They didn't avert their eyes. They straightened their backs when she entered. Not because of her rank, because of what she had endured, and what she had refused to let die in silence. Harrington, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale. His denials, his television interviews, his smear campaigns, all of it had collapsed under the weight of documented truth. His influence, once untouchable, was shattered. For the first time in decades, the colonel faced a reality no rank could shield him from: accountability. Soldiers whispered of his downfall with tones of disbelief, sometimes relief, sometimes even grief. Authority alone, they realized, had never been enough to bury the truth. For Elena, the moment was bittersweet. She had survived humiliation, endured isolation, faced the retaliation of a man whose pride had no limits. But this was not simply a personal victory. It was systemic. The culture that had once protected him, even celebrated him, had been forced to confront itself. Courage had spread, and change, though fragile, had begun. Still, she felt the weight of scars. Late at night in her quarters, she opened her notebook again. Page after page of notes stared back, every word she had written, every detail preserved in ink. Armor she had forged in solitude. Now those pages were more than memory. They were evidence, proof that silence could be broken. And yet, as she traced her handwriting, she felt the ache of what it had cost. The loneliness, the whispered rumors, the nights staring at herself in the mirror, wondering if she was mad to believe one woman could challenge the weight of rank. Vindication did not erase the journey. It only made the scars visible. Still, she carried them with pride. One evening she stood in the mess hall alone. The room was quiet, tables empty, shadows long in the dim light. She stared at the latrine door, the place where her humiliation began. For months, that memory had been a wound. Now it was something else. Not just pain. A reminder of what silence can do, of what courage can undo. Her reflection in the polished metal of the door was steady, older somehow, marked by months of fire. She whispered softly, a vow no one else could hear. This ends here. It won't be buried again. Why does survival feel incomplete without meaning? The investigation had ended, but Elena knew the journey was far from over. Harrington was gone, stripped of command, his arrogance shattered beneath the weight of truth. Yet what remained was bigger than him. The culture itself. Silence had allowed him to thrive. Fear had protected him longer than rank. And unless that silence was broken beyond this base, others like him would rise. She refused to let that happen. The first public event she attended after the investigation was not a celebration, but a panel on military ethics and leadership. The room was packed: officers, enlisted personnel, civilians. Some leaned forward eager. Others crossed their arms, skeptical. Elena sat at the front, her uniform sharp, her posture steady. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't dramatize. She didn't embellish. She told the story the way it had unfolded, the humiliation, the isolation, the long nights writing in silence. She spoke of the fear and of the few who had broken it. Parker, Jenkins, Torres. And she spoke of what silence costs. When a young officer raised his hand, voice hesitant, and asked, "How did you keep going when it felt like no one was on your side?" Elena paused. The memory of the toilet water, of her trembling pen scratching against paper, flickered sharp in her chest. "I focused on the truth," she said finally. "Humiliation is powerful, fear is real, but if you let them dictate your story, they win. I wrote everything down. I trusted a few who stood with me, and I reminded myself that silence benefits only the abuser." The room fell still. Heads nodded slowly. In some eyes, she saw sparks, small flames of courage that might one day burn through someone else's silence. Back on base, changes began quietly but tangibly. Training on ethical leadership became mandatory. Anonymous reporting systems were strengthened. Officers were reminded that rank was not immunity. Soldiers who once whispered in fear now spoke in cautious honesty. The culture was not perfect, but it was shifting. Elena took on new responsibilities. She mentored younger officers, taught workshops, and traveled to other installations to share lessons. Her story spread, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a model of resilience. And though the scars remained, they no longer felt like shame. They felt like markers of survival. One evening, months later, she returned to the mess hall. Soldiers ate in clusters, voices loud, laughter carrying easily through the space. Life had returned to the walls that once pressed in like a prison. She paused at the latrine door, the place of her humiliation. Once she had avoided even looking at it. Now she allowed herself a quiet, private smile. The humiliation had once been raw, suffocating. Now it was something else. A reminder of what courage could do. A ripple that had spread far beyond these walls. Outside the base, her story had sparked wider conversations. Other soldiers, men and women both, began to share their own experiences. Journalists traced patterns, asking hard questions about leadership, accountability, and the cost of silence. And everywhere she went, Elena carried the same message. Silence is complicity. Truth, no matter how small, can burn through fear. On her last night at the base before reassignment, she stood on her balcony, looking over the perimeter fences. The wind carried voices below, boots on pavement, laughter spilling from the mess hall, the steady hum of a base learning to breathe again. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of months finally lift. She had endured humiliation. She had faced isolation. She had confronted a man who believed himself untouchable, and she had survived not just intact but stronger. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself. Change didn't stop here, it spread. And as the night settled over the base, Captain Elena Ramirez turned from the balcony, her resolve steady. Not a victim, not a survivor alone, but a catalyst, a woman who had proven that dignity, even when dragged through humiliation, can rise unbroken. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.